So you might have heard about China's recent increase in nuclear missile silos, suggesting a major change in their military ambitions. So let's explain what's going on and why the US is particularly worried. And if you enjoy this kind of video, then be sure to subscribe. Historically, China have kept a pretty measly nuclear arsenal. In the second half of the 20th century, when Russia and the US were in an intensive nuclear arms race, China decided to stay out of it. And this has meant two things. Today, China has a far smaller nuclear arsenal than either Russia or the US, and it isn't signed up to any bilateral non-proliferation treaties, unlike Russia and the United States. It's worth noting that China is a signatory of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, but this isn't particularly effective. Now, because China isn't signed up to any data-sharing non-proliferation treaties, and because China doesn't really like any military data sharing, no one knows exactly how many nuclear weapons China has. But the US Department of Defense estimates that in the last 20 years or so, China has had about 200 nuclear warheads, 100 intercontinental ballistic missiles required for delivering those warheads, and about 16 missile silos for launching and storing those missiles. For context, that's about as many warheads as Britain, but far fewer than the US or Russia, who have about 6,000 apiece. Russia and the US also have far more ICBMs than China. The US, for example, has about 400, while Russia has about 300. China also has far less delivery capability than either Russia or America. The Federation of American Scientists estimates that China has roughly 150 launchers for its land-based missiles, compared to America's 400, and just 20 nuclear-capable bombers, while America has 66. This was in part because China's historically been committed to a policy known as minimum deterrence. Essentially, China has maintained the smallest possible force capable of surviving a first strike, and able to conduct a retaliatory strike, but that's it. This is different from the US and Russia, who have a frankly insane number of nuclear weapons. To illustrate, it's estimated that 100 nuclear warheads would ruin the entire planet, which means that the US and Russia have enough warheads to destroy human society 60 times over each. But anyway, this all used to be the case, but in June and July, satellite images from Planet, an American firm, seemed to suggest that this was changing. In June, the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies, an NGO in California, identified 120 new silos being built in Yunnan, in the desert of Gansu. Then in July, the Federation of American Scientists said that it spotted China building as many as 100 silos in eastern Xinjiang, near the city of Hami. Given that China has only 16 known silos, this would represent a massive increase, up to about 250. So why are they building so many silos? Well, there are two possibilities, and unsurprisingly, both are pretty worrying. The first is they're building as many silos as they have ICBMs, which would mean that China has also massively ramped up their ICBM production. And given that each ICBM can hold 3 or 4 warheads, their warhead production too. Now, this would be worrying for obvious reasons. China ramping up its nuclear arsenal will stress out both the US and US allies in the region, like Taiwan and Japan, and suggest that China is taking the possibility of nuclear war more seriously than ever. This will be especially worrying for the US because China has recently developed a new ICBM known as DF-41. The DF-41 will be China's first road mobile, i.e. easy to hide, and solid-fueled, i.e. easy to launch, missile that's capable of hitting anywhere in America. The other possibility is that this massive increase in silos is part of what's known as a shell game. Essentially, countries sometimes build silos without building missiles, because then, if another country tries to attack, they can't know which silos the missiles are actually in, which means that they can't preemptively destroy China's missile capability without attacking all of the silos, which is obviously a lot more expensive. Now, while this might sound like an improvement, at least China aren't building more nukes, right? It's almost certainly bad news, because it means that China aren't interested in any sort of nuclear non-proliferation or arms control. To explain this, you need to know a bit about US-Russian arms control. The US and Russia have signed a whole load of arms treaties, the latest being New START, which was signed in 2010. New START limits the number of deployed strategic warheads to 1,550, down from the 6,000 allowed by the original 1991 START treaty. And New START was renewed until 2026 in February of this year. New START works by allowing the US and Russia to peer into each other's missile silos 18 times a year to check that the other side is keeping their word. If China are playing a shell game, then peering into their silos won't be enough, because they can just move the missile around between silos to avoid detection. And there's also evidence to suggest that China aren't really interested in arms control. They keep their nuclear data completely secret, and they've not actually released an official figure since 1964, when they successfully tested their first ever nuclear weapon, and they've refused to engage in any nuclear dialogues. In 2020, Trump tried to get China involved in the New START treaty, but China basically told him to get stuffed, in part because Russia also weren't particularly keen on three-way talks, and insisted that if China were involved, then so should other countries with similar capabilities, like France and the UK. Because while a shell game means less nukes, it also makes arms control more difficult. The other question worth asking is whether this means that China has abandoned their minimum deterrence policy. On one hand, increasing your silo capacity by 1,600% does look like a more aggressive nuclear strategy. It's entirely possible that China is moving towards a more US-Russia nuclear strategy, where you use your nuclear arsenal as a signal of your superpower status. This was US Secretary of State Antony Blinken's hot take, who accused China of sharply deviating from its decades-old nuclear strategy based on nuclear deterrence. On the other hand, it's possible that China think the minimum deterrence threshold has increased. The US has significantly improved its offensive and defensive nuclear capability since Bush pulled out of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in 2002. Obama and Trump both heavily spent on nuclear weapons tech, and China were particularly annoyed by America's deployment of a THAAD missile defense system in South Korea in 2017, which, according to China, would be able to monitor Chinese territory. So it's possible that China is still committed to its minimum deterrence policy. It's just that they think they need more missiles in order to guarantee retaliatory capabilities against the US, who have enough capabilities to destroy most of China's nuclear arsenal and enough defensive capability to block a weaker attack. Either way, this is a terrifying development for, well, everyone. Whatever the case, this is a symptom of worsening China-US tensions, and could end up sparking another nuclear arms race. And anyone who knows about the history of the US-Russia nuclear arms race will rightly be worried. Because when two countries are on the edge, even an innocent miscommunication runs the risk of escalating into a full-scale nuclear disaster. It's also just clearly insane to have enough nuclear weapons to destroy the planet. And if you'd like us to do a video on the madness of nuclear weapons, or the history of the Cold War, and some of the terrifying stories from that chapter of history, then drop a comment below. Also, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified every time we release a new video. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. And if you want to see your name at the end of videos, then you too can back us on Patreon. The link to that is in the description.